you're mentioning C.P.E. Bach brings up the issue of performance of the work. The work really hadn't been heard in its entirety until later than that, and C.P.E. performed the credo. Maybe we could just talk a little bit about the history of the performance of the piece we now know as the B minor Mass. C.P.E. called it the Great Catholic Mass as a list of his father's works. But maybe starting from that point, let's maybe take a little tour of what had happened to that work going into the 19th century and then into 20th and even 21st centuries. Mm-hmm. Maybe, George, you want to take us on a tour?
Well, C.P.E. Bach seemed to preserve his father's performance tradition, because as far as we can tell, the performance that he presented of the credo section, the section that he seemed to admire the most in Hamburg in 1786, used forces similar to those of his father in terms of size. There's one vocal part per voice. The instrumental parts, there a limited number of deaths for the strings, and very similar to Leipzig. He didn't have the oboes d'amore, so he substituted strings, for instance, in the Et in Spiritum Sanctum, but otherwise retaining an almost, if you dare say it, a chamber version of the B minor Mass by today's standards. But then in the 19th century, it was revived in Berlin and Frankfurt as a choral society piece. In Berlin, it was performed with the Missa Solemnis, the credo section once again, and actually using C.P.E.'s parts, but augmented. So they had performance forces of about 200 people, as far as we can tell. So it immediately jumps up in size, and then that continues through the 19th century, so that by the end of the century, in Bethlehem, PA, for instance, Friedrich Wohler presents it with 400 performers. And I recently saw a poster of the Bethlehem performance, and it's termed New Production. Not performance, production of the B minor Mass, which is really something. So it is this mammoth piece. Schweitzer was actually the one who said, maybe we're using too many, shouldn't be a course of 400, but maybe only 100. And then it begins to pare down in the 20th century. Robert Shaw presented it with a chorus of about 50 people, bringing it down, and then Nicholas Harnoncourt gets down to about 30, and then finally get down to Joshua Rifkin, where it's a quintet. So it's a work for all seasons. It can either be the enriched B minor Mass or B minor Mass light, right? Depending how you want to view it. But what's interesting is it seems to work in all contexts. I mean, it's a versatile piece. It still can be extremely effective with an immense course as well as a chamber group. Mm-hmm.
I would just throw in a side note about the performances of the Mass in B minor. Having given many pre-concert talks for various groups that do the whole thing as a concert piece with really top-notch orchestra and top-notch chorus, it's very interesting to see what happens in the second half of the piece, because you run across this really interesting challenge of going from the end of the credo into the Sanctus and into the Hosanna, where you've got a lot of big trumpet and drums, D major music in a row. And it's fantastic, and it's like, you know, it's orgiastic almost. You know, there's just too much wonderful trumpet and drums, yeah. D major music in a row. And it sort of points up for me that it doesn't really entirely work as a concert piece, because as a Mass, the only movements of the ordinary of the Mass that you actually have physically next to each other are the Kyrie and Gloria. So they work magnificently all the way through. But what's supposed to happen is that there's other stuff happening in between the end of the credo and, you know, might be 5, 10, 15 minutes later, whatever, that you get to the Sanctus, so you're ready for that. So that it's not meant, I guess what I'm saying, aesthetically, it sounds like it's not really meant to have those movements right next to each other. So it works fantastically as a concert piece, but strangely enough, it works even better as separated out elements. So maybe the ideal way to perform it in concert would be to have some other, like an organ piece or something else in between.
Intermezzo.
Yeah, exactly. Intermezzo, like Handel does in the oratorios, where you have an organ concerto in the middle of the oratorios. I think that would make the Mass even more powerful, and I throw that out as a possibility to perform.
I think even within the Missa, too, there are, the Quoniam, for example, is just, you have a horn player who has to sit there waiting for his turn, Then he has to suddenly come out and play a fiendishly difficult part and then disappear. And there's that third oboe player in the song who just sort of sits there for a while and then plays.
If you have a really good player, though, you can do it. I mean, I heard in Lincoln Center a guy who indeed did sit there the whole time waiting, and he came out and he absolutely nailed it. He hit every single note. Tuinus het Zwart, a Dutch horn player, and I mean, he got a standing, or like triple standing ovation at the end because it was such an incredible feat. But it can be done, and I'm sure that Bach wouldn't ask people to do something that can't be done.
Right. Though in New York, because of union wages, they often want to pay the horn player for only 1 hour. So he'll walk on stage, play the part, and then leave because they don't really want to pay him to sit through the whole piece. It's really shameless.
It helps if you have a soundproof room nearby and he can warm up for 20 minutes too.
In Europe, that wouldn't happen.
In addition, no.
Yeah.
Well, I would like briefly to come back to what George described and just point out that the big white spot in our knowledge is between 1750 and 1785. The 35 years between, well, Bach finishing somehow the piece and the performance of the Cymbalum in Hamburg. What happened in between? There are, well, this is something that we or other people need to explore. We have the copies that were made for collectors in Berlin, for the Amalienbibliothek, Johann Philipp Kirnberger. Is this only for the purpose of collecting pieces, or did he have something in mind with it? And even more importantly, the copy Johann Friedrich Hering made in around 1760, which actually I think there may be some hints that the performance was at least planned. So there may have been performances that we don't know of, but maybe at some point.
Also appears in Vienna at some point, right?
Yes.
During this period.
Yes, absolutely.
As well.
Yes.
So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It strikes me that so much of Bach's music accommodates many different instrumentations, performance renderings. I grew up listening to the Swingle singers be doing their way through Bach. We've had Stokowski orchestrating Bach organ pieces. I'd like to know your own personal feelings about authentic performance practices. Bach does seem to be able to come across spectacularly no matter what kind of forces you use. But how do you all personally feel about going off on these tangents as opposed to authentic period performances?
It is music for all seasons. That is, you can interpret it in modern dress or Baroque dress or classical dress or romantic dress. It's incredibly durable stuff. I mean, Exhibit can use it in a rock piece, and it's terribly effective. What I do think the early music movement has shown us is to restore the nimbleness of the music. So to take two examples, a recitative, a secco recitative, a dry recitative. When I was a boy, they were performed in a very ponderous, heavy way with a bass line dragging out through the whole thing. And somebody conducting it as well. So it was very, very heavy. And now they're performed very lightly with just enough accompaniment to keep the singer in pitch, but essentially allowing the singer to sing it almost as he or she would speak it. And so it's a new insight. I mean, suddenly, wow, you know, those recitatives are really interesting. And the other area, for me, that the early music performances have really illuminated is dance music. That again, when I was a child, the performances were very 19th century oriented when much of the dance tradition had been lost, and they were very ponderous, so that every beat counted, and it was Bach, and it was Lutheran, and it was very serious, and by God, there was no secular influence in there. We'll make sure. And so it would be very heavy. And then the early music movement came along, pared down the ensemble, went back to Baroque practices where the dances are performed as dances, so that, for instance, in a 3/8 piece like the Osanna or the Pleni Suncelli, you really accent just the first beat, and you're conducting it in a very light 1, as opposed to a very serious 3. And to me, the early music movement has added greatly to our enjoyment in that way. Though again, I think one can have it also with large forces and it be equally moving in its way.